number. I think in our science, toxicology, you remember that there is a branch that is still based very much on observation and taking pictures, and that's histopathology, and it's becoming smaller and smaller in time because everything had to be measured, and everything that is measured had to be converted into a number. And when you have a hypothesis about explaining something as complicated as the entire chain of events from exposure to dose to responses, there you have numbers, open numbers, and numbers and numbers. Then you have to link all of them. That is when a mathematical formulation that describes how this number correlated with each other are necessary. Hence, you need a model. I think increasingly with all the machine and all the technologies that we have, we become a very quantified society. We measure everything. If it cannot be turned into a number, nobody is interested. And so that's the way of science. We are moving this way. And in our sciences, we are worried about exposure to particles. The branch of toxicology that had to deal with exposure to particles has existed for a long time. We worry about exposure of dust to workers such as coal miner. It used to be a huge industry worldwide, and coal miners who inhaled particles develop what you call pneumoconiosis, which is a terrible disease of the lung due to so much particle in the lungs that they cannot, it obstructs the lung function and you cannot breathe properly. And in countries like China, still at the moment, there's still a lot of mining industry, and we worry also about the worker in China because they work still in a very same 20th century ways. So ever since the Roman time, people has known that working with dust causes problems. Now, as our society, our culture progress, we move from coal mine dust to asbestos. If you trace the clock back in time, asbestos at the turn of the century, at the 20th century, was God's gift to society. People nowadays have to pay the price for exposure to asbestos, but you shouldn't forget that it had managed to insulate our industry for years and years and years, of which without all this material that we use for insulation, it would have crippled our economy long time ago. And the story there is still to be learned, that exposure to insoluble dust of micron size, because at the time we haven't got down to the nano, but they're micron size, cause problem, cause lung problem. It causes chronic inflammation due to chronic exposure, and it leads to fibrosis, which is your lung become scar, okay, and then it stops functioning because the lung had to be very, very soft and tender and clean for it to function. And when your lung begin to stop functioning because all scar tissue, that it doesn't breathe in and out anymore, and it causes breathlessness. It's because the lung is where the blood-air barrier comes from. There's not enough air that's been converted through the blood. You begin to lose consciousness easily, and in many cases, it is leading to cancer, a very special cancer, as in the case of asbestos, is mesothelioma, when the particle get into the pleural region of your lung, and after 20 years or so incubating, it turned cancerous, and to this day there is no cure of it. And people are still dying today of mesothelioma. And with all this history of particles exposure, we have learned, and we use all the technique at the time in order to understand and describe and try to derive way of controlling all these various ailments. So at this point in here, let me point out to you about the background where we come from. So as I say to all of you, and the legacy is still with all of you who work in nanotechnology today, is that the mode of exposure for the coal miner, for the people who work in the industry, are still inhalation. Dust are in the air, yeah, and you inhale them. So even to this day, when you go to nanotechnology conference, NanoToxicology conference, lots of the endpoint, the study, the cell line or whatever, are still lung cell line, because inhalation exposure is still the most popular route of invasion of this material into your body. With nanotechnology, you begin to think of other mode of exposure, but still, insofar as workers are concerned, it's still very much inhalation. And the second point that I want to make is that our science is all about preventive medicine. Everything that you hear, everything that we learn about the mechanism of toxicity and so on, where does it lead to? It leads us back to exposure. The only way you can stop the ailment, the only way you can stop all this problem is by controlling exposure. You can't do anything once it's in the body in the massive quantity, whatever, however you describe it. That's it. You're stuck with it. So the only way you can do is to control exposure. So what we do, and all of you study this, and you study the dose responses in toxicology, is simply so that we can find out a way to control exposure, to avoid the dose in the body such that it causes an adverse effect. Our science profoundly and fundamentally is still a preventive medicine. Everything leads back to exposure. We are not talking curative medicine in most of this. Also, with the emergence of nanotechnology, for the first time, we can think about what we learn from toxicology in order to design drugs and so on. But that is very new. And still, today, everything that you do still leads back to regulation. You always hear about regulation at the back of everything you do is because it's control exposure. The problem with the nano paradigm is that with all the best of science you can work, you can come up with control limit for exposure. However, because nanoparticles are very small in terms of mass, but massive in terms of atom matrix, it might lead to control limits that are non-enforceable. Because, for example, today they work out with carbon nanotubes, they come up with a control limit of 7 micrograms per meter cube. With the best of science, you cannot deny the science, but if you bring that to industry and say, keep your factory at this level, they just laugh at you. It's impossible. It is totally impossible. And why are we stuck with that? Because history, we have always been working with the kind of material that you cannot change. You cannot change asbestos. Asbestos, whatever, you dig it out from the mine. You can't change silica. Silica is what you dig out from the mine. So what do? You just have to control exposure in order to avoid it. But wherever there is the limitation, there's a way around it. Because the thing about nanotechnology and all the nanoparticles that you work and you make, they are man-made. They're not asbestos. You make them. And if all of us work and try to understand what is it that makes them toxic, which is the mission of nanotoxicology is to find out what is it that makes them toxic. There is no reason why you can not modify this thing. You cannot modify the surface of this thing. You cannot modify the shape of this thing to render them less toxic. And this is the concept of safe by design that people are taking on now, is that we have to strike a balance between something that is safe and something that is still industrially useful. Because you can make something totally safe, but it doesn't work. There's no point. It's just a heap of dust. I mean, what's the bloody point of that? You see what I'm saying? So this is the thing that we make. So the point that I want to say here is that the main route is still exposure by inhalation. If you go down the prevention route, that's what it is. Data are still from animal experiment and in vitro experiment. So given the state of things there, then to describe the biodistribution from the exposure and so on, we use PBPK just like the chemical. Also, the parameter that describe the distribution of these particles are very different and the story are different. But as George pointed out, if you can think of something and you can measure it, then you can model it. That's the point that George wants to say. If you can measure something, there's no reason why you cannot describe it mathematically. And that is the point. And given that our society is moving toward the digital age in which everything is numerical now, so the use of modeling will undoubtedly increase exponentially. And I personally believe that this is an extra toolbox for all of you. You are unlike me. I came from an older generation where we believe that what we see in histopathology is actually quite cool. Now everybody says that you look at down in the slide, what you see, you can see anything you want. You just shift it a bit and you see something else. But in my generation, you can see the fact that we can see it at all makes us feel so incredible. But now you have to change things. Everything is numerical now. And if you have a column of number, at the moment you say, how does this column of number is linked to another column of number, you are modeling already. You see? So you cannot avoid it. And every one of you, the modeling is not something reserved to the physicist and the mathematician. Every one of you make number. If you can make number, you have to make sense out of them. And the only way to make sense out of number is to have a model of some sort. And so that, as a 21st century scientist, you all need to have. And you can work with mathematicians, you can describe what you say, and they can help you, but don't turn away from modeling. That's the thing. So, in my history, as I say, in the old days, when you look at asbestos or silica lung from workers that are exposed to it, this is before the nano day, when if you are exposed by inhalation, then the problem is in the lung. And that is still very much the case, and it is the shadow over all your shoulder research in nanotoxicology. Most of the assay, oxidative stress or whatever, you went to do the entire PhD about nano and so on, but it's all the lung. Vicky taught you it's all lung cell. Why? It's because of the mode of exposure. That was historically the case. And still, now every one of you, the majority of the assay are still lung assay. They still look at the lung, and it's still the most predominant mode of exposure. And we understand this much. If you inhale particles will get into your lung. Now, how are particles deposited in the lung? It depends on the structure of the lung. Your lung has been made by nature. It's been designed thousands of years ago. It took a lot of evolution. Oh, thank you. See, I'm incapable of fixing this. It has been designed for thousands of years. So the lung is actually an amazingly efficient structure for stopping foreign matter that come into it. That is why as you go down the branching right to the alveolar region, it becomes smaller and smaller. And the reason it becomes smaller and smaller is that it traps everything that is big. So the bigger particles that get into the lung are trapped. And the ciliated cell that has hair, that removes them mechanically up, and you cough them out, you spit them off, and that's what it is. But for micron and nano-sized particle, they go all the way down to the alveolar region, and that is where the blood-air exchange takes place. And that region has to be clean and sterile. So if foreign matter got that far, they'll be picked up by the immune cell that patrol and control the cleanliness of that region. So the lung has a resident macrophage population. Okay? Every one of us has a macrophage population in the lung. So when the particle get down, as free particle in the alveolar region, they encounter macrophages. Now there's two key functions. People will challenge me if there are other, but in particle toxicology, the most important thing are the ability of macrophage to find this foreign matter, phagocytose them, which is a scientific word for eating them up, and clearing them. They don't just eat them, they have to clear them, okay? So those are the two functions. Because in a pathological situation, the macrophage will stop clearing them, and this is when you have a problem, okay? So remember, key word to take home is that they phagocytose, they eat this particle, and then they clear them. The way the macrophage clear, as we understand it, is that they move up by a chemotactic gradient up the mucosal escalator, and in a human being, we either spit it out or we swallow it. But that is the way, the normal clearance of material to keep the alveolar region free. But as all of you who work with or know something about cells, that cells die all the time. Every cell has a finite lifestyle, and they die and they are replaced by new cell. And your entire body, your skin, for example, the majority of your skin today has probably been replaced continuously. So it's not as if it's always the same old skin, that the cells and everything die and are replaced. And so the macrophage die and they release the particle inside them, and the whole cycle will take place again and again. But in the case when a critical mass of this particle is reached because you continuously inhale this nanomaterial, then an inflammatory reaction will take place. And that is when, instead of releasing and clearing the nanoparticle, there would be a phenomena that we call the granulomatous disease. Is when the macrophage, instead of clearing them, they begin to gather together and they form this granuloma. And this is an inflammatory reaction. At that time, you also see the infiltration of neutrophil into the lung. And this is the hallmark of an inflammatory reaction. So at that point there, this clearance will disappear. Particles that come in afterward are no longer clear because the immune system has decided that it cannot clear it normally, and what it does is it walls everything up. It cannot destroy, it cannot get rid of it, so all it does is it tries to bury it in these masses of cells. And of course, this granuloma, once they develop, they cripple the function of your lung. It becomes all fibrotic, it all becomes, it chops things up in the lung, and therefore you no longer breathe properly. And you see that in all kinds of diseases such as tuberculosis, disease such as silicosis, which is due to inhalation of silica, asbestosis, due to asbestos, and our prediction is that there's nothing different about nanoparticle from all these things. And what I show you next are the data to show that, in fact, from big to small particle, it's just a continuum of these things. That's all there is to it. Using the right metric, everything just line up together. So the point in here I want to make is that the disease that we're most likely going to face with nanotoxicology, at least in a traditional mode, are the granulomas kind of disease. But this is the point. This is a very important point. In my generation, the way to stop the granulomas disease is by controlling exposure. We just have to know that we keep exposure low enough, you avoid the whole thing. But now with almost half a century of toxicology that studies this granulomas disease, for the first time, the challenge on your generation is to develop drugs that restart the traffic of these macrophages, that really either help the macrophage to deal better with these particles so they can clear them off, or in the case of bacteria, delivering drugs that kill the bacteria, targeted to the population of the cell that are responsible for all of these things. And that is going to be the future. Our generation can only work with controlled exposure. We can't do anything about the particles that we face off. But your generation has two challenges. The first I mentioned already is the safe by design. If you know what make particle toxic, you can always design a better particle that are just as useful but with less of the feature that make it toxic. That's the first challenge you can do. The second thing is if you understand the disease, and the disease from big to small particle are very similar, as I said, the new challenge for all of you is to deliver drugs right to where the problem is, and then stop the granulomatous disease. And I think that is a huge challenge. And this is something that you guys can do, because we spend half our life teaching you about what causes granuloma. But if you know what causes granuloma, you can reverse engineer it. And that is the challenge. The reason that so many drugs has failed so far is simply because you don't know how to target correctly. So much is wasted. The problem with drug delivery has always been side effect, side effect, side effect. So much of it is wasted because you do not have a way of delivering drug targeted to the right cell. But now with nanomaterials you can. And with that you can reverse this whole process. And this is something that I think your generation will take up the flag. This is something that we can do in the next 20 years. Because we know we spent 2 generations to understand the disease, and now you can do something better than us. So, to show you, the reason I want to show you this experiment is simply because people always say, where does nanotoxicology come from? Well, it came from this experiment here. It was done at the end of the 1990. Okay, it was sponsored by the UK government. They are interested in looking at the dust called barium sulfate. Okay, barium sulfate has been used for X-ray and so on, and they want to make sure that it's a low toxicity dust, a dust of no importance. So they asked us to do an experiment with it. And even then in the 90s, we used to use TiO2 as a negative control dust, because way back, even in my time, we have always known that titanium dioxide is a low toxicity particle, and we know a lot about it. So what we do is we set up an experiment to compare the barium sulfate with the TiO2. The way we do it, and this is one advantage we have, better than you new people, young people, is that back in the old days, we can kill lots of rats and nobody challenged us. So we did animal experiment. Now this thing, you can only do it in vitro. But in the old day, we can do it and get away with it. So we use a TiO2, which, as I say, a run-of-the-mill, low toxicity, negative control dust that we know anything. The size is 2.1 micrometer. So you're talking micron-sized particle in here. And those are the days when we first decided to measure the surface area, the specific surface area. That was very novel, because up until then, all of this type of experiment, we done it by mass. But this one, we measured by surface area. Okay?
And how did you measure it?
By BET. Those are the good old days. We measure by BET. Okay? And we set the exposure, the aerosol exposure at 25 milligram per meter cube and 50 milligram per meter cube at respectively different duration. So these are very expensive experiments, but we can drag them into hundreds of days, yeah, in groups and groups of rats. Okay, so we know something else about this BSO4. We know that it has very similar density to the TiO2, 4.5 versus 425, not very different. But we know also that it's twice the size of the TiO2, you see? And therefore the surface area is smaller. So there's something in there, by providential way, suddenly we choose 2 dusts that are very contrasting. One actually is half as small as the other one, and therefore twice the surface area. And because we know how particles are deposited in the lung, up until then, all the inhalation experiments are done when they compare 2 dusts, is that they set them to the same aerosol concentration. But you know that aerosol concentration might be equal, but if dusts are of different size, then the dose it gets into the lung are different, because the bigger particle, as I explained, you get stuck in the upper stern of the lung and get clear. So we knew that much. That is why also we set the other experiment to the same kind of time duration, we increase the concentration in order to make sure that the lung dose are the same. And since it was still the early days, we know that inflammation matters, but we don't measure oxidative stress and all the mechanisms that you do. All we measure are the number of neutrophils that pour into the lung. And that, even to this day, is still the marker of inflammation in vivo. If you have lung inflammation, you wash the lung out and you count the number of PMN, it's still a valid marker of inflammation. So we did that. We run this thing, and this is what you see. Okay, so the first two graphs, these are TiO2 and these are BSO4. These are the amount of TiO2 in the lung for all the way up to, as I say, 200 or so a day. So you can see the buildup in the TiO2 in the rat lungs in here. And you see, in the equivalent way, you see the buildup of the BSO4 in the lung. And you can see that our choice of aerosol give us similar lung dose. We managed to get similar lung dose in here. But what is very interesting is that when you look to the lymph, you see that there's a reaction. Suddenly, dust begin to pour into the lymph. And now that is the first immune response that you see, because when the body begins to react, the first thing it does is try to get the dust into the lymph so that it can recognize an antigen and so on. So you suddenly see with the TiO2, very nicely, you have a flare-up in the amount of dust you find in the lymph. But you see nothing. You see nothing in the BSO4. In spite of giving more or less equivalent dose in the lung, you see absolutely nothing in the lymph. And so we look at the inflammation. And you can see the inflammation in the TiO2 again happen. Just as you see about what has happened in the lymph, you see it happen with inflammation as well. You count the number of PMN that you wash out from the lung and you see it. And you see nothing with the BSO4. And that was really weird. So at the time, we'd look on further and we plot out the dose response. So we plot out, again, the response is still the number of PMN, yeah? But the dose is the equivalent lung burden that we measure in the other graph, yeah? So in the x-axis here, you have the lung burden in milligram, and in the y-axis here, you have the number of PMN. And you can see there's two distinctive dose response curves. You have the higher one, which are the combination of the data that you get from the two TiO2 experiment. They flares up like this. And then you have a much shallow dose response with the BSO4. So you see one thing we learned, though, that there are thresholds. Yes? The white blood cell leukocyte. And you see in here that there is a threshold. When the lung dose is below 2 milligrams, nothing happens, and then they begin to flare up. Again, with the BSO4, you do not see anything until 6.2, 6.3 or something milligram before it flares up. So at this point here, we could have written a report to the government and say, well, it's very clear the TiO2 is more toxic than the BSO4. And that would have been it. And then regulation would have to be based on different type of dust. It's like, oh, well, we have to regulate TiO2 differently from your regulating BSO4. However, and this is when we enter nanotoxicology here, is that when you describe the lung burden again in terms of surface area, so you just convert it using the conversion of the surface area centimeter per unit of dust and so on, gram of dust, then suddenly you see these two dose response curves just collapse into one. And this is the beginning of nanotoxicology, because now all of you talk about the surface that causes the reaction. What's on the surface? How do you functionalize surface? You cannot talk about this entire field of nanosafety without getting away from surface. People talk about surface charge, people talk about surface area, people talk about the crystallinity. It's the nature of the surface that causes all this toxicity. And this is the basis of which is this. This was the first time when you say that in order to describe the dose response for particle, you had to use another metric than mass. If you use mass as metric, you end up with different dose response. But if you use a surface area, then in fact there's no difference between the TiO2 and the BSO4. It's just that the BSO4 has a smaller surface dose than the TiO2. Otherwise, what is on the surface of the TiO2 and the BSO4, the cell react to it in the same way. But that doesn't mean that all particles react like that. There are particles with very reactive surface area. In that case, they will cause a dose response that are steeper than what you see in here. One such a thing that we look at is the crystalline silica. Even if I put the crystalline silica on the same graph and describe the dose in terms of surface area, you will still see that it flares up much faster at lower surface area dose than this thing. That goes to show that surface matters, you understand? And that is why we get to this problem with regulating particle exposure. Because also surface area and surface reactivity drive the toxicity of this material. You still regulate exposure in terms of mass. You still say that your workplace cannot have an exposure exceeding, let's say, 7 micrograms per meter cube or something. You see? But if you work with these things, this number becomes increasingly smaller and smaller to the point where it's unenforceable. You cannot keep, or you cannot even measure exposure level at that level without distinguishing from the background. Because any room will have some kind of infiltration of some form. You can't tell whether I got 7 micrograms per meter cube or something. Is that carbon nanotube? Or is it something that leaks through every time somebody opens the door or something? You can't tell. And this is the problem, is that even with the best of science, you derive some number that are justifiable, but it's not enforceable. And the whole point about preventive medicine is that you have to set regulations that can be enforced. If you can't enforce it, then this route leads us nowhere whatsoever. And I haven't actually mentioned the economic cost to industry if you want them to keep their factory that clean. I mean, you see these factories that make these particles. They're like any other factory. At 7 micrograms per meter cube or something, you make it clean like a lab space. You know, like a pharmaceutical lab. There's no way this guy can do it. So you got to think very carefully about where we are. So again, so this was the first thing. But you can still challenge me and say, yeah, but they are still micron-sized particles. I say, yes, you're right. But those are the days when Gunther Oberdoster in America began to do inhalation experiment with nanoparticles. And he gave me some data at the time. And you look at this graph in here, it's the same unit in terms of surface area, but the yellow number in here are the first TiO2 nanoparticles that were obtained from his experiment. And you can see here that it's the same spectrum in surface area from the big to the small particle. It's the same one. So now you have a continuum from big to small particle. At least if you look at the response, which is the lung and the inflammatory reaction in the lung, then this is the case. So we thought that was the reason, and we thought that most of the inflammation in the lung is simply because particles, when they get into the lung, they do not readily encounter macrophages because there's not enough macrophages in the lung. When the particle gets into the lung, the first cell that it lands onto is an epithelial cell. There's not enough macrophages to patrol every single alveolus for it to catch a particle just like that. So the very, very clear experiment that we would look into comparing between in vitro and in vivo was to do and interaction with nanoparticle and epithelial cells. So on your right here, we have exactly the same experiment, but in vitro with epithelial cell, and you can see the same kind of surface area, those response that we obtained with in vitro versus the data that we had before with the in vivo. And that is simply because the situation when you deal with the toxicology of the lung is that there are two major cells that are at work in here. So you have a very interesting interaction between particle epithelial cell and macrophages. They're not just particle and macrophages or particle epithelial cell separately, but an interaction between these three things. And this again brings us to have to think about this issue carefully. If we are going to design in vitro systems that actually mimic the story in the lung, you need multiple culture cells that try to mimic this kind of situation. So on this respect, so we developed model, and as George say, and you have heard about it early on this morning, that like all our data, every one of you who work with doing experimental science knows that given that you do everything exactly as before, whether you're a chemist or you're a toxicologist, you never get the same answer. You do all the conditions and fine-tune exactly to the same condition, and you always get something different. It's called variability. And then on the top of that, there's uncertainty that has been explained this morning when you do not understand all this or what is going on. So what we really do here is that once you have this model, you can turn it into a probabilistic model, just like this morning my colleague O'Brien has demonstrated, to try to capture the variation in the data that we see. So there you can see not only that we can simulate the average animal, but we can also simulate the variation that you see in the data. And now this is when we move beyond the lung into the data, and there are very few data at the moment to try to describe how the particles that come from the lung actually distribute into other organs. So there you see a model that is a bit similar to what George has talked about early on with chemical. And there I work a lot with Wolfgang Kreiling, and you can see he gave me some data with nano-iridium for a single installation of this particle in the lung. And you can see there you have the majority of the particles are still in the lung, but you can also see them in the brain, in the kidney, in the liver. But this model needs to be validated because the data are so few at the moment. So we also use the same model to describe, in this case, nano-silver inhalation for 6 hours. And you can see again what happened in the lung, but also at the nasal, the lymph, the brain, the liver, the heart, the kidney, and so on. So we are making our way there, and there's a lot of similarity between the two interests in chemical and particle toxicology. But as I say, with the advance with nanotechnology, we also have to think about other mode of exposure. And in this case, we're looking at the problem when nanoparticles are injected directly. In this case, they inject TiO2 nanoparticle in the blood intravenously and for the rat, and then they see what happened. And you can see in there the majority of them quickly turn up in the liver. And this is something that the pharmacologists are very familiar with. And all the data that we have used are all given in here. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that, we need the model because it gives us a way to describe the distribution of nanomaterial in the body. And we can also link that with the dose response, because giving the dose sooner or later you get the response. And with that, you can also use it to extrapolate your exposure to other level, other type of exposure regimen, so you can predict what happened at lower exposure. And one of the things that George has touched, and I reiterate in here, that this model can be readily used to extrapolate to human because we know all about the kind of metabolism between animal and humans and so on, to scale it up to humans. So they are, in a way, they are not, I don't think they will ever replace what you do, but they are a toolbox for all of you, that the future scientists of your generation will have to know all this kind of thing. People that come before me, they can have the excuse that they haven't got a PC. This takes so much time. They don't know how to do things. But you cannot avoid that. Everything that we do is being converted into number. We live in the digital age. Everything is a number. And the moment you begin to ask the simple question, what's the relation between two columns of number, you are already modeling. So you are all modeler already. There is no escape to it. Now some of you are better with maths in describing this relation. Others are not so good, but there's no stopping you from working with a mathematician to help you to work this thing out. And this is a very, very useful tool for you to have. It allows you to question all your assumptions, your hypothesis, quantify your hypothesis, and test it whether it's actually right or wrong. So on this mode, I want to move on to very quickly, and I hope all of you have it here, that we go to a practical.
Everyone's computer should already be logged in with MATLAB.
Yeah.
Is your computer?
Yeah. So what I am using, and this is something I like to talk about later on, is that since this is the first course in modeling, we have not harmonized the different software. So this morning, O'Brien showed you a lot of things that he used his own software. I use mine, and other people use different software. There's no preference for one over the other. It's just that if I had a bit more time, I would have done it like him, but I didn't. So you have to cope with me on this. And I use MATLAB. MATLAB is a very powerful tool, but it's not very user-friendly, but I'm sure you can cope with it. And I think I have it here. It looks like something like this. And everybody got MATLAB switch on? Yeah? I have 3 files, and you can see MATLAB consists of 3 files. And the one that I want to show you, okay, there's a file. If you look at it, there's a file called TiO2_model. TiO2_model is a file that contains all the parameters to run your model. So it has description of the particle, the concentration, the physiological parameters such as the ventilation rate in the rat as it inhales, this kind of thing. So those are the parameters that you fit into your model. Yeah? Can you help these ladies? Are you okay? You're in the front row. Are you okay with seeing?
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah? Okay. She's good. So she's good. You okay? Yeah? Yes. So if you log on to there, you will see that it has all the description of all the model parameters. Yeah? Then you have the model itself, which is just the mathematical description of the various flow of the particle into the different compartments. What you have in here is the model of the lung only, because this is where I can show you more data. Okay? And then you have the third model, the third file, called the TiO2 raised blur, which is nothing more than a plotting file, because after you do the simulation, you want to run it and you want to see it with the plots. So basically, the most important one are the TiO2 model and the model. Those are the 2 files, okay? And you can see in here the TiO2 model that I'm running it, as you say, for this time for a concentration of 10 milligrams per meter cube. I try to simulate an experiment in which rats are exposed to 10 milligrams per meter cube for 690 days for the TiO2 particle that has a surface area, density, and so on. Yeah, and you have the ventilation rate, you have the deposition fraction, because depending on the size of the fraction of the particle, only a fraction of it is deposited in the lower lung, and so on. So what the point I want to make in here is that these are just ASCII file. Anyone, you can take this file home and study them. You can open it with any editor, any ASCII editor. There's nothing fantastic about it, that you can take it home and look at it in your spare time. And what you do is to run it. To run it, all you have to do is to type TiO2 underscore model. Okay? If you can type TiO2 underscore model and press return, it would run it in a tick. Okay? Then, to see the result, you type TiO2 underscore raise PL, which is the name of the file where the plot is. So that's basically the ABC of MATLAB. And there you see. Now, I want you to all look at this graph here, because this is actually the result from a real experiment we did with rats that inhaled the nanoparticles. And this is very important because it clearly describes the situation. If you imagine you inhale nanoparticles,
where is the one section?
Oh, you minimize that. Minimize.
Ah, okay. It's in the other.
Yes, it's here.
Here. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. So, what is important in here? Okay, if you look at this curve, it's very strange. Is that it goes up to a certain lung burden, and then it begins to build up. And before that, it looks as if it plateaus out towards a steady state. The reason that it plateaus out as a steady state is because you inhale particles, and then the macrophage remove it. So what goes in balance with what goes out, and then your lungs end up with a steady level. Okay? And as long as it's steady level, this dose is low, it stays steady, and nothing happens. But in this case, during this 690 days, when you reach about somewhere about 5 milligrams, that's the threshold dose. And at that point, the macrophage just stop clearing. And because they stop clearing the particle, you see the dust build up linearly from that point on, because there's no clearance anymore. The macrophage has turned granulomatous, so everything is switched off. Instead of clearing it up the lung and have a steady level, it now tries to capture all the particles and wall them up. And what you see afterwards is the linear buildup. There is no clearance after that point. And amazingly, at that point, when you begin to see the buildup, that is when your immune system responds, and the dust begins to show up in the lymph node. This is a very common immune reaction. When you have an infection, when you have a flu or a cold, you see your lymph swell up. And that is when they try to take the flu virus to your lymph. If you ever have a bad cold or something, you can feel it here. It swells up. And this is the equivalent, but this is the pulmonary lymphatic system. It begins to swell up in there. And you see, at the time when this experiment was done, back in the 80s, people didn't even think about relating the dose in the lung with any responses. They didn't even measure the responses. So they didn't even wash out the lung and measure it. But you can, given the data that we have, you can estimate the dose response, the kind of pulmonary infiltration of PMN in there. And you can see there that this data was the first data that, because the exposure was dragged out for over 690 days, it allowed you to see the bit when things are okay, which is up to about a year, up to about 300 days, things are working wonderfully. And then from 300 to 600 and something, when they stop working, usually if you have a shorter experiment, when you squeeze things down to, let's say, 3 months, and you increase concentration, you will not be able to capture this inflection between something that works normally and something that flares up. And this is what you have. So what happens if you do this same experiment, but with nanoparticles? The difference between the nanoparticles and this particle is that it will have a massive surface area. So if you go and you change in your program, if you go back to your program and you change, yes. Okay, you go back to your TiO2 underscore model, yeah, and then you go up to, you see the parameter called SA, which currently is 6.67 for this big particle, yeah. If you change it to 60, so put a 0 on it, yep, save it, because if you don't save it, it won't work, okay. 60 to 60, because 60 to 100 meters square are the kind of standard nano TiO2 surface area. So if you change it from, and don't forget to save it, press the save, because otherwise it wouldn't run. Yeah, if you change it from 6 to 60, yep.
Which one is that?
And you have to go to TiO2 model. And in SA,
right.
Now you leave it at 100, for example. Okay?
It went over the roof, I think.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So if you now run it, okay? If you now run the program, yeah, you will see that you run it again, and you plot it. I haven't done it. No.
You have to change the diameter on the surface area. You have to change the diameter at the same time on the surface area.
Can I? I don't know what your question is. Let me explain.
Because there are two parameters, the diameter and particle surface area.
Yeah. The diameter. No, but let's assume for here, in reality, you're right. If you change, you have to change the particle diameter as well. But here we try to make an exercise to show that, let's say a situation in which they have a larger surface area, but they're agglomerates. So they look like an agglomeration, a bigger one. But you're right, you can change it. But here you just make things easier. And if you have MATLAB, you can go and you play around with it. Here is just for... Then you can see, hello.
This one just came up. I think it's just a very slow system because so many of us are doing it.
I don't know about your system, but what I want to say in here that you see, if you have a nanoparticle, then the surface area is large, then the inflection happen at much lower dose. So you see, it start off and then it stop clearing, and you have almost a state time. And very early on, then you have the lymph that pour on. Yes.
And you usually use the BET area?
Yes. At the time, we used the BET. Now we know that it can. BET works wonderfully if your particle is not porous and is solid. It pick up the nice surface area. If the particle are like the TiO2, they are very smooth surface. The BET.
Yeah, but I mean, if the particles are aggregated, maybe the actual surface area that can be in contact with the cellular interface.
This is now a nice question, because you see, surface area is a very good way, it begins to show us what actually happened, because it's a phenomenon of contact. However, be careful, because the real dose is the effective area, meaning the areas that are available for the contact. Because we had another experiment, but I don't have it here, is that we have a porous particle that has an internal surface area. You use BET to measure it, it gives you a massive surface area because it picks up everything. But when you do the experiment, it's not as toxic as that. And the reason is because it's the contacts that make the reaction. So only a fraction of the surface that you measure actually come into contact. Here you have, it works simply because the TiO2 particles, if you look at electron microscope, they tend to be smooth, and the BSO4 are very similar in that respect. So although they are chemically totally different, the cell reacts to it in a physical manner no different from anything else. It reacts because it feels the contact, and the BSO4 is a bigger particle, has a smaller surface area, therefore less contact, and everything is fine. With the TiO2 and the nano TiO2, you have more contact, and the whole thing at a certain dose, it begins to flare up.
Is it just because the number density increases when you change the?
It's the surface area that increases, and I think it's the surface area that really drive the dose response, because here you only see things in surface area simply because the BSO4, the TiO2, has similar reactivity per unit area. So when you compare, all you see is surface area.
The lung reaction, that because phagocytes work by numbers, so each one can.
But you see,
one particle.
Yes and no, because the situation is much more complicated. As I said early on, if you inhale the particle in, the first cell that came into contact with the particle is not the macrophages. There's just not enough macrophages in the lung for a particle that comes into your lung, land on the macrophages. The first contact between the particle and the lining cells of the lung. You see? And when the contact is obviously surface by surface, and when that begins to saturate it, because of too many of these contacts, the epithelial cell begin to react, and it send out signal, and that is when the macrophage will come. The macrophage need to be drawn into it, and they come in, they hoover, and they leave. But if there's so many particles, then they might not actually be able ever to leave the surface because they continue to move. And I think I once tried to explain it this way. Imagine a game, yeah? Imagine. You have two rooms, same surface area, yeah? Okay? Every minute, I throw in a bucket of particles. One is a bucket of small particle, same mass. One is the big particles, equal mass, yeah? Now, the rules say that if you can pick up all the particles, you can leave. And when you leave, you'll be replaced by somebody else. Okay? This is what really happened. Now, let's say that you're all blindfolded, and you can only detect the particle because the sensor on the wall, on the floor, say you pick it up. So when I chuck the particles in, the first contact are the particle and the floor, because that's what I do. It sends out a signal, and you have to go and pick it up. And I do it every half a minute. I throw in. Now the rule says that the big particle, there's fewer of them. You pick it up and you leave, and somebody else come and replace it. With the large particle, before you can pick them all up, another bucket will come in, and another bucket. And this is what happened. At some point, there were just too many particles. They can't leave anymore. You see what I'm saying? And the whole thing comes to stand still. And if you stop, I take you out after the end experiment, the one that has to deal with a small particle, will be absolutely loaded with small particles because you cannot leave. You can just go around and around and around. And this is what we find out in this experiment when you wash out. The macrophages in the TiO2 are absolutely packed with nanoparticles. What the other one, as you can say, I show you the BSO4, they're larger particles, they're clear. That is the principle behind that game. Think about it. It's exactly what happened in your lung. You inhale this thing every so many minutes. Yeah? You're taking particles. If you are a small particle, you can clear them. You up to a certain point, and then you become more and more laden and laden and laden, and this stop like this. And this is something that we have worked on ever since. And this is the beginning of it. You can play with these things. You can change the surface area. You can change the particle size. And you can also change the concentration. You can lower from 10 to 5 to whatever, or increase it. And you can see how actually the dose response will happen. Yeah.
Clarifying question. So
Yeah.
if I have the same number of concentration of large particles over 200 nanometers and 120 or 50 nanometers, the same number of particles, not the mass, will be toxicity effect.
First of all, as I say to you, is that even if you set the same number concentration, first of all, the dose will be different because the big particle will be trapped in the upper airway and they are cleared mechanically. So the actual dose that you get into the region of the lung will be less. That is why in our experiment with the BSO4, we had to increase the concentration in order to get equivalent dose. You see, so that's the thing. But once you get equivalent dose, the contact is made by surface area, and the smaller the surface area, the less of the reaction. And from there on, you drag on to everything that has to do with surface area, and you have nanotoxicology. And this is the beginning of all of it, when we begin to... Because toxicology before that were all done on mass. You describe those responses in mass. And this was the first time when you say, oh, surface area. If you use surface area, you can explain more than you explain mass. You see, and in my data, I show very clearly that had we not looked at surface area, you would have to regulate the TiO2 and the BSO4 separately, because they're two separate dose response. But now with this, you begin to think,
you say about the surface area of particle.
Yeah.
But are you what's the surface area of lung? Because it's a condition of, if it is health good, it is one surface area. If not so good health, it's more.
You have those are the thing, the subtlety that you have to bring into this model. Here it is.
It is model.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it is in the sense, even when it is an experiment, it's still a model, because the rats that we have are very homogeneous. They are lab-bred rats, and we diminish the variability in the population. Your question is that what happened in real life when big people, small people, diseased people, and so on. Then you have to vary. You have to use this thing, and you say that you would have a different parameter set for, let's say, somebody who has a compromised lung. You have something for a child, somebody, and so on. And here we're just basically working on animal data, which is obviously much more selective.
Another question. I will use this maybe before for the production of smoking.
I personally have nothing to do with smoking, but I know people who actually work for the cigarette industry, and they do use it. But they have their own conferences. We don't go to their conferences, so I can't tell you.
But this model is possible.
It is possible. Everything is possible. I mean, but I don't work for the smoking industry, the cigarette industry. I once discovered when I was in a conference And then I realized that they have an adjoint conferences.
Mechanism the same.
Yeah, no, it's the same. But I wouldn't encourage people to do that. But they do. They have their own. They have their own conferences when they actually use this model to explore. And because I talked to some of them over coffee, they say we want to explore the merits of different inhalation regimen, where whether you get a bigger hit by doing a higher frequency like this, or you take a deep breath and so on. And they use this kind of thing to look at the deposition of particle in a sense. I mean, I'm fascinated by, they didn't convince me to go and listen to what they do. But they do work on something very similar like that. So, yes, if you think that this might be of use to you, well, good luck.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up this session. We have some coffee over in another building, and then there'll